Fire Emblem 8 is one of my favorite games in the Fire Emblem franchise, and definitely the one I've played the most, so I thought it would be a good choice for my first tier list video. I want to start by establishing a few assumptions for this tier list. One is that we aren't using the tower or any map battles. Two is that we're playing at a somewhat quick pace. Not LTC, but we're going to be warping the hard maps and not sticking around on maps for extra time just to grind EXP. But for some units I will make a note if I think they're better in slower play. Lastly, this is an Eirika route tier list. A lot of Sacred Stones tier lists take an average of a unit's performance on both routes, but I'm a lot more experienced with Eirika route, so that's the one I'm going to tier. I will mention units that I think are better in Ephraim route, though. Lastly, I want to note that Sacred Stones is not a terribly difficult game. You can totally beat the game with anybody on this tier list, nobody's unusable. So I just wanted to clarify that's not what it means if a unit is low tier. It just means that they're a little weaker relative to the other units in the game. With that in mind, let's get into it. Seth is our lone member of S tier. He's by far the most dominant unit in Sacred Stones, and a lot of other high tier units are high in part because of how they support or move him around. He's our Jagan, and naturally that means he dominates the early game, but while most Jagans at least fall off a little bit relative to the rest of your army, Seth really doesn't. He's a primary combat unit for the entire game, and a great choice to be your boss killer for a lot of it too. Beyond his great stats, Seth's extra movement is also very important because it helps him get to early objectives faster and allows him to reach objectives from a warp from further away. He's one of the most over-centralizing units in the series, to the point where a lot of early maps are going to be Seth soloing the main objective while your other units do easy side objectives or team up on enemies to feed kills to your project units. There's not too much to say about him. He's super strong, he's high mobility, and he has perfect availability. That's basically everything you want out of a unit, and your strategies on many maps should revolve around him. Next up we have A tier, and Vanessa is our first unit in it. She's an early flyer with excellent availability, and this makes her a prime target for early investment. Like most early game units, Vanessa has a small training arc, but that's true of almost everyone in the early game that isn't Seth, so it's not a huge knock against her. Usually the way early game plays out is that Seth dominates the main objective while your 1 to 3 project units go on a journey of self-improvement, farming EXP off random enemies or completing random side objectives. And Vanessa helps you get a few of those random side objectives with her flying utility, like flying over to grab a village in Chapter 5. And she even helps you with the main objective in Chapter 7 by rescue dropping someone over the river. Eventually Vanessa gets to promotion, and she's super helpful for the rest of the game. When you need to ferry Seth over terrain, Vanessa can do that. If you need someone to fly over a mountain to deal with moguls or a magic user like in Chapter 12, she's great for that too. If you're on a tricky map like Chapter 9 and you need a flyer to support your second paladin to deal with the top left of the map, Vanessa is the girl for the job. Basically, you get respectable combat, flyer utility, and good movement from Vanessa, which is super useful on a lot of maps. There are things for Vanessa to do on basically every map, and she's often one of the only candidates for the job, or the best candidate for the job. Joining early is also a huge deal for Vanessa. It makes her an enticing candidate for the early Elysian Whip and the Energy Ring. We don't get another flyer until Chapter 9, and she comes at level 4, so while Vanessa has a small training arc, she gets to do it during the easiest chapters in the game, and gets to be ready for promotion around the time that first whip shows up. Next up we have Moulder. Moulder is ranked high here for a very simple reason. Warp is good, and Moulder gets to be your warper with very little effort. He starts with C-rank staves, and he gets to spam torch on fog maps and pick up 40 staff EXP when he promotes to bishop, and then you're in business. It's going to be no problem to get him to warp. Prior to getting warp, he isn't doing anything hugely important. He can heal your projects in the early game while they get their experience, but he's going to be too far behind Seth to do much around the main objective. Really, Moulder is on his own training arc to get A staves, but he starts at C and has so much time to get there, so it's really not an issue for him. An important thing to note is that even though Moulder's magic isn't very high, it's high enough to do the most important warp skips, so the only thing that his low magic really hurts is his combat, but you don't care too much about that. Moulder is just there to warp. Two things that people sometimes bring up when talking about Moulder are his con and the Slayer skill. However, I don't think these are terribly important. We'll start with con. Moulder has pretty high con, so he can use heavy tomes without losing much speed. If you send Moulder Sage, he actually gets to enjoy the +5 speed bonus from Excalibur more than other mages, because they often lose 5 or more speed from the tome's weight, and he doesn't. However, your other mages aren't exactly having trouble doubling anyway. Saleh is a common magic combat unit, and he's just faster than Moulder. At 10-5, Moulder has 9 magic and 13 speed, Saleh at level 5 has 16 magic and 15 speed. So while Moulder doesn't lose speed to heavier tomes, he doesn't end up that much faster than other units who already aren't having doubling problems and sport more magic. The main priority for Moulder should be getting to warp as soon as possible, and Bishop helps him hit this. You also would like S-rank staves because Latona is pretty helpful for skipping the final map. For Bishop Moulder, sometimes people bring up Slayer as a point in his favor, but it's not that impactful. Slayer makes you deal more damage to monsters, but by the time you promote Moulder, you will probably have already completed the early Eirika route monster maps, so Slayer doesn't do too much until the late game monster maps, which include the Egg map, which really emphasizes movement that Moulder can't keep up with, Darkling Woods, which Moulder should help you with a warp skip instead of fighting, and the final map, which can also be a warp skip. Additionally, effective weaponry against monsters isn't exactly hard to come by at this point in the game, so even if you don't warp skip, you have better combat units available. All of this is to say, you should do the Bishop promotion, but it's really just for the staff rank. If Moulder could do literally nothing but staff, he would still be A tier. Our next unit is Tethys, and given that she's our dancer, it's probably not too surprising to see her up here in A tier. Tethys has all the usual dancer utility, meaning she can help you cover more distance, let your best combat unit fight things, or give you more staff uses. That last one is particularly important. I stressed the importance of warp in the late game when talking about Moulder, and Tethys can always give you an extra warp by dancing your warper. And sometimes you need an extra warp, one for your boss killer, one for your lord to go seize, so it's nice to be able to do that. The only issue Tethys can sometimes have is keeping up with your army. Sacred Stones has a lot of powerful high move units like Seth and Vanessa, and you'll probably be using at least one other flyer or paladin as well. It's easy for Tethys to fall behind the group at times without a rescue drop, but she's still pretty much always going to find something to do, and providing extra warps without having to grind an extra unit staff rank is really nice. Not too much more to say about Tethys, she's good for the reasons dancers are usually good. She doesn't have the rings like Nils and Ninian do in FE7, and she can't do combat like more recent dancers can, but she does the most important thing, which is giving a unit another turn. Saleh, our next unit, is probably the unit that benefits most from Eirika route. He joins in Chapter 12 instead of Chapter 15, which is relevant for a few reasons. First, his bases are very good for his join time in Eirika route, and it's pretty helpful during the big route maps. Gargoyles are some of the tougher enemies on his join map, but Saleh can handle multiple at once. The other benefit of Saleh in Eirika route is that he gets 3 extra chapters to build his staff rank to become warp ready. In Ephraim route, this is a lot tighter because you don't have him as long. Having a second warp unit is nice, and Saleh's warp range is going to be longer than Moulder's, which can let you warp some lower move boss killers like Myyrh, where Moulder might not be able to warp them quite far enough. Basically, if you want Saleh to be a secondary warper, he can get there without too much effort in Eirika route. And if you decide you don't care about the extra warper, he provides good 1-2 range combat that you'll appreciate a lot in his join map, as well as the upcoming desert route map where he doesn't lose any movement. After Saleh, we continue with B tier with all 3 Cavaliers, and I'm going to talk about them as a group because they're very similar. I made a whole video talking about this trio of units, so I'm just going to summarize that here, but if you want to hear the argument in more detail, I'll link that in the description. Basically, these units all fill a pretty similar role where their job is to do rescue drops, be a secondary combat unit, and grab side objectives like villages. All of them do these jobs almost equally well. The main differences are that Franz with a little luck gets to double some more enemies, while Kyle is more bulky. Ford doesn't have a ton going for him statistically. In a vacuum, Franz has the best performance as a paladin, but not by a huge margin. Despite this, I like Kyle a bit more than the other two on Eirika route. The reason for this is that getting Franz to promotion in Eirika mode can be a little tricky without cutting into EXP you want to feed to other units you want to promote. Basically, in early game Eirika route, you'd really like to be giving experience to Artur and Vanessa. Artur so that he can get Slayer for those big monster route maps, and so that he can be a second warper. Vanessa because she's a really strong early flyer that's difficult to replace. Both of those units, as well as Franz, need kills set up for them in the early game. It's not really possible to get all 3 of them to promotion unless you're slowing down or not using Seth to do much combat and leaving those kills for your project units. I prefer to invest in Artur and Vanessa because there aren't really adequate replacements for them. In contrast, there's not a huge difference between what Ford, Kyle, and Franz can do, and all of them hit promotion by Chapter 9 since Kyle and Ford can pick up a bunch of uncontested experience in Chapter 5X. Even if you're fast clearing the map with Orson, Ford or Kyle can get to where they need to be to promote by Chapter 9. Basically, all these units are pretty similar. Franz has early utility as well as the potential to snowball if you play slower and feed him a bunch of kills. Kyle and Ford get a bunch of uncontested EXP. Ford is at the bottom here because there's not that much of a reason to use him. If you want to use one of the 5x Cavaliers, Kyle has slightly better stats, and if you want to early invest in a Cav, you just use Franz. So while Ford isn't really much worse than the other two, there's just not that much of a reason to use him. Maybe that means he should go lower on the tier list, but performance-wise these Cavs are just too similar for me to have a big gap. I suspect this changes a bit in Ephraim route, where getting Artur promoted ASAP is less of a priority, since you don't need to get him Slayer in that mode. So that leaves more EXP for Franz to suck up in the early game. After the Cavaliers, we have our second flyer option in Tana. Tana comes in Chapter 9 at level 4, which is a bit of a bummer. If you level her up, her performance will actually be quite good. She ends up with more strength than Vanessa at the same level. However, there's no reason they should be at the same level. Vanessa can already be promoted by the time Tana joins. Still, this doesn't make Tana bad. There are a lot of maps where you want 2 flyers. Even in her join map on Eirika route, she's great for grabbing the bottom village or ferrying a unit down there to grab the village and route the bottom part of the map. She can also pretty easily get to a point where she can take on weak enemies like moguls, mages, and soldiers on her own, and then even stronger enemies than that if you give her a bit more investment. So Tana is definitely worse than Vanessa, but there's lots of maps where you want a second flyer or even a third or fourth, and it's not the end of the world that you have to level her, at least in Eirika route, because in Eirika route you have a couple big route maps where she can do a little combat, and on Cormag's join map you're going to be sitting around for a bunch of turns waiting for Cormag to spawn, so that can be a good time to find some kills for Tana to take. Even if you don't want to take Tana on her training arc, she can do all of the things flyers do where stats don't matter much. So that's rescue dropping other units, ferrying thieves across the desert in Chapter 15, grabbing chests, grabbing villages, and killing some of the extremely wimpy enemies in Sacred Stones. I think Tana is also helped a bit in Eirika route by Cormag being worse. She can be level 10 or above by the time he joins, and she gets a few chapters of utility over him. Her better speed can be a legitimate niche over Cormag in this route because Cormag really wants a speed wing, and Tana doesn't need one. Speaking of Cormag, he's our third flyer and one of the easiest to use. While Vanessa and Tana need some leveling, Cormag comes ready to promote and with an Elysian whip in his inventory. Unfortunately, in Eirika route he joins pretty late, coming at the very end of Chapter 13 instead of in Chapter 10 in Ephraim route. Cormag is a lot more appealing in Ephraim route because he joins before Tana has any time to gain EXP and before Vanessa has had too much time to eclipse him. In Eirika route, Tana can be around promotion by the time he joins, and Vanessa has had even more time to gain experience, so her combat can be good enough to do all of the difficult combat that you want a flyer to do for the rest of the game, which leaves less of a niche for Cormag. Still, despite coming later, there are maps remaining where you want flyers, and Cormag is a serviceable one. His big issue is just his speed. Instantly promoting him gives him 13, which fails to double some enemies, so he would really like a speed wing, but there's some competition for that, so he's not guaranteed to get it. You should always deploy Cormag when you need a flyer, but he's just not as dominant in Eirika route as he is in Ephraim route. Next up we have Gerik, who has a special place in my heart since he was my primary combat unit and my boss killer in my 0% growths run of Eirika route. So that should give you some idea that his combat is pretty solid, and this is also true in a growths context. You get him before the big route maps in Eirika mode, so you can instantly promote him, slap a hand axe on him, and let him cook on those maps. What hurts Gerik in a growths context as opposed to 0% is that Seth gets his growths, so he can do a lot of the combat and boss killing you wanted someone like Gerik to do in 0% growths. Still, you're going to want Gerik for the route maps, and there are plenty of other maps where there are 2 things you need to do, and Gerik can do one while Seth does the other. He can take on the Kalak portion of Chapter 15, for example, and anytime you need combat done, Gerik can usually do it for you. One issue that Gerik's combat can have is that he really wants to hit some speed levels, so if you get unlucky, he might have trouble doubling faster enemies. Generally though, Gerik is a big help on any map you aren't warp skipping, and if you want him to be a boss killer, he can do it, but in most maps he is not the only one that can do it. In slower play, Gerik can feel like a godsend. He can 1-2 range down a bunch of enemies, he's durable enough to do some enemy phasing, and he comes with his own promo items, so it's really easy to just press the hero crest button and throw him at your problems. You can also promote into ranger if you're feeling saucy. He gets a horse and a point of move, but he gets bows instead of axes. I think the 1-2 range is more important than the move, but this is one of the few Sacred Stones promotion choices that's actually kind of close. Artur is our next unit, and he starts as a monk and his initial performance is fairly unimpressive. He doesn't do a ton of damage, he doesn't double much, and you need to set up kills for him. However, there is a significant payoff for training him. The first thing you get out of training Eirika is a pretty early bishop, meaning that you'll have Slayer for the 2 route maps that are full of monsters in Eirika mode. I know I said Slayer wasn't a big deal for Moulder, but that was because he gets it later in the game and his magic is fairly low. Artur can be a bishop with decent magic early in the game. You can't warp skip Eirika's monster maps, so having an extra combat unit that excels against all the enemies on that map is a pretty nice thing, especially since there are some difficult ones like the gargoyles and the dogs. The second payoff you get for leveling Artur is that he's another staffer. His warp range will be longer than Moulder's, which can open up some options for certain skips. Moulder's warp range is all you really need for most skips, but sometimes he'll be doing something like warping Seth and having him move max distance to the boss. Artur can warp a little further, which can enable you to use a lower move unit like Myyrh or Gerik for the boss kill. There are also times where you might want 2 warps, and there are also other staffs that you might want to use like Rescue or Barrier, so it's nice to have a second staffer at times. Basically, Artur becomes a Moulder with actual combat, so you might be wondering why he's a tier lower, and the reason for that is that it's more work to get Artur there. While Moulder gets to warp basically for free by healing and torching on fog maps, Artur needs to be fed kills in the early game to reach his potential, but I would say it's pretty worth it. Alright, now we kick off C tier with Myyrh, and Myyrh is a little weird to rate because she's great when you get her, but she's not around for that long. Myyrh joins on chapter 16 and her stats seem unexciting at first. However, she has the Dragonstone, a 50-use weapon that gives Myyrh a bunch of extra stats. She can use the Dragonstone to easily pick up some kills, and since she's low level, those kills will give her tons of EXP, which she appreciates since she has some pretty good growths. Myyrh can pretty easily deal with some difficult later game bosses, namely Leon and Morva in Darkling Woods. Basically, Myyrh only gets 50 attacks, but it's 50 very good attacks, and you only have her for a handful of chapters anyway, so you can use the Dragonstone pretty liberally without running out of uses. Myyrh is only ranked this low because you don't have her for that long. You should definitely use her when you've got her because she makes some boss kills pretty easy, which saves you some time and headache. If you're skipping maps with warp, you probably won't have to worry too much about Dragonstone uses, but if you're playing slower, just make sure you keep an eye on how many you're using so that you have a few left for those difficult late game bosses. Next up is Joshua, who I think is better than most people think. When talking about other early game units, I've talked about how they need kills set up for them, which can make it difficult to level up more than a few of them. Joshua does not have this problem. He just one-rounds tons of enemies on his own, and this means that the pattern for early game maps can very easily be Seth does the objective, your project units have kills set up for them, and Joshua just goes off on his own to kill whatever enemies are left on the map. And if you follow this pattern, the result is that Joshua can pretty easily get some levels without slowing down the leveling of any of your project units. Then he gets to promote, probably when you get your second hero crest, and for the rest of the game he just doubles everything and one-rounds lots of enemies. His only major issues are that he's locked to one range, and this is a problem, but not such a problem that you can't find things for Joshua to do. Joshua can take on lots of tricky enemies that even your good combat units can sometimes have trouble doubling, like gargoyles and deathgoyles. Joshua can always double them, so with a killing edge, he can be a pretty good answer to those enemies. There are also areas in the game with a bunch of one-range enemies, and Joshua can handle those well. Lack of 1-2 range and no horse means Joshua isn't going to be your primary combat unit, but it's very easy for him to find things to do, and he can kill enemies from the moment he joins, so there's really no training arc and no reason not to use him to do some things. After Joshua, we have Duessel, who is one of the units hurt most by Eirika route. In Ephraim route, he fills a similar role to Gerik, where he's a fairly early joining unit with great combat stats and 1-2 range, and he's even a pre-promote, so you don't need to use a crest on him. In Eirika route, though, he doesn't join until chapter 15, and at that point we only have a handful of maps left, and some of them are carried by warp. So when he does get to do combat, he still performs well, but he just doesn't get to do a ton of combat in Eirika route. Duessel is another unit that improves if you're taking the game slower or not warping. The more combat he gets to see, the better Duessel is. He would be a lot higher if this were Ephraim route, where he joins earlier and his stats look even better relative to other units at his join time. Next up is Ephraim, who is kinda similar to Duessel in that he's a unit with very good combat in his own route, but who just joins too late on Eirika route. He does have 2 good PRF weapons in Regenleaf and Siegmund, but in practice he's not around that long, and a lot of the maps he is around are skips where he's not the guy being warped. Siegmund is a nice thing that he gets access to though. It's a sacred weapon that he has exclusive access to, and that allows him to one-round a lot of enemies, which can help him catch up a bit on EXP, particularly if you're taking maps slower instead of warping them. His good stats, 1-2 range, and Siegmund allow him to make contributions whenever you need him to do combat, and getting the horse on promotion means he can keep up with your faster units. Unfortunately, there's not that much combat left that you really need him to do, and a lot of your units can one-round at this point, so he's not terribly unique in that respect either. Last in C tier is Colm, and this may seem kinda high for him. Sacred Stones has buyable chest keys, and you eventually get Rennac and just use him instead of Colm. But Colm has a few important steals. He gets you a bunch of stuff you don't really care about in Chapter 3, an energy ring in Chapter 7, and then some chests in Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, there are 3 chests, but buyable chest keys haven't become available yet. You get 1 chest key in Chapter 3, and that covers one of the chests, as long as you saved it. But you're not getting all 3 of them without Colm. There is an enemy thief on the map, but for some reason the thief's AI is set to just attack and steal from you. He will never actually open any of the chests, so you aren't even able to let the enemy thief open a chest and then kill them for the item. If you saved the chest key from Chapter 3, you'll probably use it on the chest with the Elysian Whip, so I give Colm credit for the other 2 chests, which contain a Silver Sword and an Angelic Robe. I think I would trade any one of the units below him for an Angelic Robe and an Energy Ring, so that's how I arrived at his position here. Colm can also hypothetically get you an extra speed wing by stealing one from Amelia on Chapter 9 and then letting her run away. When she returns later, she'll have another one. However, a lot of people want to recruit Amelia on that map, and you have to take the map pretty slow for her to run away, so I don't really give him any extra credit for this. Still, an Energy Ring, an Angelic Robe, and a Silver Sword isn't too bad. After Colm is our first unit in D tier, Garcia, who is not a terribly exciting unit, but is pretty helpful in the early game and can be okay longer term if you want. Garcia joins and has good strength, enough so that when he doubles he tends to one-round, which can actually be important on some maps. In Chapter 4, for example, Garcia can one-round the 3 skeleton reinforcements to the northeast, provided they roll down on speed. He also has enough bulk to take a couple hits. Having decent bulk and inconsistent doubling makes Garcia a good choice to help set up kills for your project units, and this is an important job in the early game. The ability to stand in a spot on enemy phase with a hand axe and chunk down 3 enemies without dying so that Vanessa, Artur, and whoever else you want can swoop in for the kills is really nice. Garcia can also work okay long term. I don't really think he's worth the investment, but he does have big strength and promoting him to hero helps with his speed issues a bit. I say helps with because it doesn't fix them. Garcia will have 10 speed after promoting at level 10, so he'll still struggle to double all of the things that you would like him to, but it does help you double some more things than Warrior does. So I mostly value Garcia for his early game contributions. Someone needs to take hits and set up kills for your project units, and Garcia can be the one to do that for you. Next up is Inez, and he really just suffers from being bow-locked. He actually has pretty good combat stats, but he can't really enemy phase because he doesn't counter, and Sacred Stones is a pretty enemy phase heavy game. Inez can be useful when there are some particularly difficult enemies that you want to player phase, Death Coils and Gargoyles being the main time Inez gets a chance to shine. Ultimately though, being a player phase unit limits your usefulness in Sacred Stones, so Inez struggles to contribute as much as units above him, because 2 range lock is just really tough. If you can't have 1 to 2 range, you would much rather be locked to 1 range because you'd still be able to enemy phase a lot of times. So it's just hard for Inez to find places where he can make a lot of contributions. From this point shorter, you may notice some of my descriptions for the units are going to get a little shorter, and that's because a lot of the remaining units are pretty straightforward in my opinion. They either don't have many maps they help on, or are early game units that struggle to justify getting the experience that they need to promote. Our next unit, Dozla, is an example of a unit who just doesn't have many maps where they get to do important things. He joins later than Gerik with worse stats except for a small lead in strength and a decent lead in HP. The speed is the big issue. He joins with 9, meaning he really struggles to double and thus struggles to one-round. Where Dozla can be useful is when there are some random lance enemies he can kill where time isn't a big issue. One example of this is the gargoyles that spawn in the bottom left in Village of Silence. You aren't usually ending this map the turn that they spawn, so it's not a big deal that Dozla takes a couple rounds to kill them. He can also handle the Pegasus Knight reinforcements in Chapter 15. He just doesn't double enough. He's a 6-move unit with combat that isn't stellar and minimal special utility in Eirika route. The special utility he does have is mountain and water walking, but there aren't a ton of situations to take advantage of those features in Eirika route. In Ephraim, he gets to rescue drop someone over the river in Selena's map, but he doesn't have anything like that in Eirika mode. Speaking of Eirika, next up we have our protagonist. Unfortunately, even though she has perfect availability, she doesn't have a lot to contribute during it. In theory, her rapier should give her decent combat in the early game, but there aren't a lot of cavs for her to fight, and the armors just aren't a big issue. Seth clears them fine, and you have a couple mages that can help, and Garcia can even take care of them too. So she doesn't get as much value out of her rapier as you would like, and without weapon effectiveness, she just doesn't deal much damage because she has very low strength. She's also very frail, which can make it difficult for her to see a lot of combat without risking a game over. Eirika's available on a lot of maps, but she spends a lot of those maps either being rescued and brought to the objective or avoiding all the dangerous combat. On promotion, she gets a horse and a powerful PRF weapon, which solves her damage problems to an extent, but it doesn't solve her frailty. So even once she has it, she mostly contributes as a one-range lock player phase unit, which is better than before, but it's still not that good. After Eirika is Syrene, a unit I think is a little underrated, which might be surprising given I have her pretty low here. But I often see this unit rated in F tier, and she has at least 2 maps where she gets to contribute. You're happy to have any flyer you can get for the Gorgon Egg map, and she can help with rescue dropping that you need to do in Darkling Woods. This isn't much, but I think it's more than the lowest of the low Sacred Stones units. Don't expect her to do great combat or contribute a ton in other maps, but she gets 1 map of good utility and can be a rescue dropper in 1 more, which isn't great, but I think it keeps her out of the lowest tier. Next up we have Knoll, who is weirdly kinda similar to Syrene in that he gets 1 map of utility in the Egg map, but not much else. Knoll's combat is really bad. His hit rates are bad, he has no luck, so you don't really want him to be countered since he might get crit. But he does have one thing going for him, which is that he can immediately promote into Summoner when he joins. Summoners can summon 1 HP phantoms that can fly over terrain and attack with axes, and this is particularly useful on the Gorgon Egg map as it's kind of like creating an extra low move flyer for yourself. And that's great since the main goal on this map is to fly over annoying terrain to go hit eggs. The only other character that can be a summoner is Ewan, who needs a much longer training arc to do the exact same thing on the Egg map. And beyond this map, there's not a ton for Knoll to do. He comes pretty late, summons are neat, but you don't really need them for anything but the Egg map. One thing I will say in Knoll's defense is that if you're playing slower, summons can be very useful. Summons can safely bait enemies, and you can manipulate AI with them since enemies love to attack phantoms even if you have other units in range. The faster you're playing and the more warps you're using though, the harder it is to find something for Knoll to do. After Knoll we have Lute, and she joins in the same map as Artur and has the potential to do some of the same things as him, but there are a few factors that make Artur a much stronger pick for investment. First, while Lute can provide similarly good magical combat, she doesn't get Slayer and her stats on promotion are comparable to Artur, so this means that Artur is going to help you out more on those Eirika route monster maps. And after those maps, Artur is going to have an easier time getting to Warp because promoting to Bishop gives him C staves, well, both of Lute's promotion options give her D, so she will need to grind harder than he does to make it to Warp. The big upside Lute does get is that she gets to go into Mage Knight, which gives her a horse and an extra point of move. She also gets to use Anima magic, so she'll do a bit better against non-monster enemies since Anima tomes do more damage than light tomes. Still, the monster maps in Eirika mode are pretty big for Artur, and being able to get Warp faster is also a big deal. Without the Slayer utility and with the slower acquisition of Warp, Lute is a tougher sell for investment than Artur is. Alright, finally we have our first trainee unit with Ross. And the way that trainees work in Sacred Stones is that they start at level 1 in sort of a baby class, and then after 10 levels in the baby class, you get to choose a base class for them to promote into. For Ross, the base class options are Fighter and Pirate. Basically, they start with low stats, but you get 10 additional levels for them to grow. Ross is rated a little higher than the rest of the trainees because he comes the earliest and it's the easiest to level him. He joins with a hatchet, which is an accurate 1-2 range axe that makes it easy for him to chip and take last hits during early chapters, and that makes it easy to get him to level 10. In LTC, you can get him to promotion in the early chapters without losing time, so the only real cost to leveling Ross is that you are setting up some kills for him instead of your other project units. The problem with Ross is that you just don't get a sufficient payoff for training him. After his fast 10 levels, he is comparable to a base level Garcia. And while Ross does get more strength than Garcia pretty fast, he's around the same speed as his father for most of the game. So you never feel like your investment pays off as much as you would hope it would, especially since Garcia is often strong enough to one round when doubling anyway, so often Ross's strength lead doesn't feel terribly meaningful. You may also notice that we're comparing him to Garcia, and Garcia isn't a stellar unit to begin with, so it's a tough sell to take on an investment project to eventually get another Garcia that isn't even better across the board. Now, Ross does provide one unique thing, which is that he can go pirate to provide early access to water walking, and this is potentially useful in 2 chapters. In Chapter 7, it allows him to drop someone over the river, which saves you a turn and is the reason Ross sees use in LTC. Outside of LTC, this doesn't matter much, it's just a turn save. In Chapter 9 of Eirika Route, you can use his water walking to manipulate the pirates on the water, and this can give you a little more time to save the villages on the map. You also have 2 flyers for this chapter, so messing with the pirates isn't something you need him to do, but it's nice to have more options. Pirate to Berserker is probably the path you want to send Ross down because the crit bonus helps him out with enemies he can't double, and it means he gets to promote with the Ocean Seal instead of the Hero Crest. With a Hero Crest, he'll have to fight over promotion items with Joshua and Gerik, but the only other unit that even can use the Ocean Seal is Colm, who you likely aren't planning on promoting. Notably, this path gives him the same 2-speed going hero does because he gets 1 from promoting to pirate and 1 from berserker, whereas if you go hero, you get 0 from fighter and 2 from hero. But regardless of which way you go, you just don't get enough payoff for the investment that Ross needs, and while his hatchet is pretty nice, it's not a PRF weapon. You can always hand it to somebody else if you want to make use of the hatchet. After Ross, we have Natasha, and she's another early healer that we get a couple chapters after Moulder, so it might seem weird to have him so much higher than her, but there are a couple of important differences. The big one is staff rank. Moulder starts with C and Natasha starts with D, so she has a whole extra staff rank to grind to get warp, and she also starts 2 levels lower and with worse magic. Basically, Moulder and Natasha both want to spend most of the early and mid-game grinding up their level and staff rank to hit promotion and warp, but Moulder starts much closer to both objectives. Natasha can get there with additional effort, but there's no payoff to using her over Moulder, especially in Eirika Route where you're training Artur anyway, and Saleh comes early enough that warp for him is more realistic, so even if you want a second warper, it doesn't have to be Natasha. Still, if you do want to use Natasha, she does basically do the same thing Moulder does, just considerably slower and with significantly more effort. Last up in D tier we have Rennac, and Rennac has thief utility like Colm does, but he joins a lot later, which means A, he has less of it to do because there aren't as many maps left and chest keys are buyable before he joins, and B, he shares credit for any stealables with Colm instead of taking all that credit for himself. Still, there are a few things for him to steal. He can grab the chests he joins right next to, which saves you a couple keys, and he can grab items for you in the desert. None of this is huge, you wouldn't really miss Rennac if he was gone. However, you'll probably at least field him in Chapter 15 for the desert items, and maybe he'll see deployment 1 or 2 more times to steal something, especially if you aren't skipping maps. The units below him have very little to do, which I think keeps him in D tier. So last up we have our E tier, and I'm going to kind of speedrun most of these units because I do not have a ton to say about most of them. Gilliam sets up kills for Franz or Ross for 2 chapters, you can break a wall in Chapter 3, then you're done with him. If you want to use him long term, you can make him a great knight, but overall he's just too slow in terms of both movement and speed. When it comes to La Rochelle, you know how I said Natasha joining after Moulder with D-rank staves is a problem in Chapter 5? Well, La Rochelle joins with D-rank staves in Chapter 11. The horse isn't enough to make up for it, but she's cool and I like her, so maybe use her anyway. Neimi is a 2-range locked unit that can't one-round anything like Inez does. The one thing she has going for her is that she can promote into Ranger instead of Sniper, but it is a long way to promotion and she can't set up kills for herself. And she's not even that great once she gets it because her stats still aren't up to snuff. She can help set up kills in the early game if you want, but that's about it. Marisa is like if Joshua joined way later and had worse stats. Not much reason to use her at all. But she can at least sit in a forest and deal with the axe guys in her join chapter if you want to use her, and I guess that's not the worst thing in the world. The last 2 units I do have a bit more to say about. Ewan is the last trainee that joins and he specializes in magic. He joins in Chapter 12 though, and I'm not super interested in a training project at that point unless there's a really good payoff. And like Ross, there's not a huge payoff to training Ewan. His combat isn't significantly better than alternatives if it's better at all, and he really ends up worse overall because his statistical leads aren't huge, and he's never going to get a good staff rank in a timely manner. The niche that Ewan does have is that he can go into Shaman for dark magic. Your only other option for a dark mage is Knoll, who is not a good combat unit. So if you want a second summoner or a Shaman that can actually do well in combat, Ewan can provide that for you. This sounds kind of nice, but the reality is dark magic doesn't let you do anything special. You can get by just fine without it, and if you want a summoner, the main thing you care about is AI enemy manipulation and baiting, and Knoll does that just as well as Ewan does, but he does it without needing any training. One thing I will say in defense of Ewan is that while he needs you to slow down to train him, his training is not nearly as painful as the trainee we haven't talked about yet. He has accurate 1-2 range, so it's really easy to find chip damage for him to do, or random kills for him to take. But he comes late enough in the game that I'm just not interested in a project unit without a big payoff. If you do level him though, 2 summoners can be kinda fun, so I recommend trying it sometime. Our final trainee and final unit on the tier list is Amelia. She joins in Chapter 9, and like the other trainees, she needs help getting her early levels. Leveling Amelia is the most annoying of the 3 though. Ross and Ewan both have accurate 2-range attacks via Ross's hatchet and Ewan's magic, but Amelia is stuck with a javelin, which she's not very accurate with and doesn't do much damage. As a result, it's pretty difficult to level her without really slowing down to a crawl. If you do want to train her, a common choice is to block an archer in place and let Amelia plink away at them with a slim lance, but I don't think that this is a productive use of your time. Additionally, much like the other trainees, there's not a ton of payoff here. She wants to be a paladin because it's the best class available to her, but at this point you already have 2 paladins. Amelia needs to gain at least 20 levels before she even starts to be comparable to the paladins you have now, so really she's competing for the 3rd paladin slot, but even in that role she still has to catch up to the other cavs. For reference, a 10-10-20 Amelia in paladin has less strength and defense compared to a 10-20 Franz. So even if you give her a ton of experience and time to grow, the payoff just isn't there. Maybe you could justify the training if she blew other units out of the water statistically in endgame, but she just doesn't really set herself apart in practice. Sometimes people argue that there being more competition in the paladin class is a good reason to send her general, because there aren't as many good armors, but this doesn't help the situation. At least in Cavalier, even if her stats aren't as good as you would like, she's still in a good class. She has high move and rescue dropping potential, and her combat eventually becomes fine, even if it's not super impressive. In armor, Amelia might be more unique, but she's stuck in a worse class where she won't keep up with your army, so Paladin is definitely the way to go, because even if she's the 3rd or 4th best Paladin, that's better than the 1st best General. Sadly, she just doesn't stand out enough in any of her classes to justify the training in my view, so that's why she's this low on the list. So that's all the FE8 units tiered, and I want to stress again that FE8 isn't a terribly difficult game, and if you have fun with a unit that I ranked low, that is a perfectly good reason to use them. I use La Rochelle, Knoll, and Ewan pretty often just because I like them, and it doesn't make the game that much harder to complete. But what do you think? Am I way off on anyone? Let me know in the comments, or if you want to discuss it more, check out the community Discord linked in the video description. Lastly, if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more content like it, consider leaving a like or subscribe so that you never miss an upload. And have yourself an awesome week.